Let me welcome all of you to this second webinar that we are doing on the imperative of resurrecting multilateralism. Let me begin with a quote, Kishore, which you might resonate. The recent meeting of ASEAN-India network of think tanks, where the Indian Foreign Minister S Jaishankar remarked that multilateralism has failed the test as the world lives through an unprecedented challenge in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, which has thrown up trust as the most valued commodity in international relations today. And let me underline the word trust. He goes on to say, just when multilateralism was most in demand, it did not rise to the occasion. If we saw little leadership, it was not just due to the admittedly anachronistic nature of key international organizations. Equally, it reflected the intensely competitive nature of current international politics. This sums up the state of the world, and there is a remarkable similarity between the world that we are witnessing today and that about a century ago during the interwar years, which resulted in the demise of the League of Nations. While at that time, a rising power refused to join the International Committee of Nations, this time another rising power is doing everything that goes against trust. It is in this context we need to understand the implications and aftermath of a number of disruptions that the world has witnessed recently. Starting with an expansionist approach in the South China Sea and in the Himalayas, and followed by trade and technology war with the US and the COVID-19 pandemic, there is complete disregard to a rules-based multilateral system of governance on the part of a regime which ironically benefited the most from the sphere of trade, connectivity, and poverty reduction. Therefore, what we need is trust building among the nations for the delivery of global public goods in a fair and equitable manner so that there is peace, security, stability, and prosperity for all. That is possible if a better sense prevails about the virtue of being a good international citizen. Therefore, some pertinent questions are, can it happen? What should be the role of the traditional as well as the emerging powers for making that happen? With this as a background, on 3rd September, we organized a webinar with a number of eminent speakers such as Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the WTO and currently the chair of the Paris Peace Forum. Among other points, he argued that the reasons behind this fall in multilateralism are manifold, and they reflected in a series of crises in recent times. And as a result, multilateralism has reached its lowest point. A major reason is division among the major sovereigns in respect to their interests and values, resulting in divergence of thoughts and actions. The hardware of international cooperation has largely become obsolete. On the one side, we have a system based on sovereignty, and on the other, there is an increasing divergence on what sovereignty means, which is hindering the system to make progress. At this webinar, Pascal also came up with a new word because what we need to pursue is polylateralism, which is that there should be the discussions in international organizations should be comprising a membership of governments and civil society as well, rather than to just leave it on governments, the sovereign governments. In that webinar, I argued that India, along with Brazil, Germany, and Japan, should be inducted into the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member. Recently, at a BRICS foreign ministers meeting, the same call was reiterated with the addition of 2 countries from Africa, which are not named, but we can guess who they are. While big powers should learn how to agree to disagree, it is the responsibility of middle and emerging powers like India to convince them about the virtues of multilateralism. That can happen if we expand the membership of the UN Security Council and reform its functions. Thus, taking forward that discussion, today we are organizing this webinar with the hope that there will be a renewed political interest on multilateralism among the global community and that all powers would listen to this imperative. In today's webinar, we are pleased to host another eminent panel of experts who will speak on various facets of multilateralism, how they help the global community to ensure peace, security, stability, and prosperity in the post-war world, and what needs to be done for its resurrection. It's time to reinvent multilateralism in a new avatar, which includes building trust, as was pointed out earlier. A recent World Economic Forum survey across the world pointed out that with 20,000 samples, which is not very small, that people would like, more equity and sustainability to be addressed as future parts of multilateralism. And there, again, the agenda on SDGs is important for us to recall. With that, may I now request Kishore to please kick off the debate or the discussion.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, for inviting me back to join your discussion, and such a pleasure to be with such an eminent group of fellow panelists today. I will stick to your time limit of 7 to 8 minutes. But as a word of introduction, let me say that, frankly, there is no more noble mission in the world today than resurrecting multilateralism. It's frankly the #1 task that humanity needs to focus on. And the reason for that is that the world has changed fundamentally. It's become a small, interdependent place. And I say, in the past, when we lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though we were living in 193 separate boats with captains and crews taking care of each boat and rules to make sure the boats didn't collide. Now the world has shrunk. The 7.5 billion people live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And our destinies are completely intertwined. But our problem is that we have captains and crews taking care of each cabin and no captain and crew taking care of the global boat as a whole. And that's why we're having all these global challenges. And if you had any doubts that we are on the same boat, COVID-19 has killed it. Killed it. It's shown how it can spread from a town in China, go around the world, and everybody. The global economy has stopped. And if you are on a boat, what's the most sensible thing to do when the boat catches fire? You first put out the fire. You don't start arguing who started the fire. But guess what? We are actually engaged in an argument about who started the fire. That's how stupid we have become, right? So clearly we need to change course fundamentally. So to understand how to change course, I'm going to, in a sense, we got to dispassionately analyze what's right, what's wrong with multilateralism. And I'm going to put across my point in a Hegelian Marxist way: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. What's the thesis? The thesis is that the West has gifted us, the world, a beautiful multilateral system. The 1945 rules-based order is an amazing multilateral framework. And if today, 75 years later, with a much more intelligent humanity, with much more intelligent, more educated people in offices, you try to recreate the UN Charter, impossible. Absolutely impossible. You get dragged down in negotiations. You get torn apart. So there's nothing more beautiful than the 1945 rules-based order. It's imperfect in some ways. But if today you started from scratch, you could never invent something as beautiful as this. That's the thesis. What's the antithesis? The antithesis is that, sadly, the West, which gifted us this beautiful multilateral framework, has been steadily eroding it and weakening it in the last few decades. And I can say this with great confidence. I wrote a book called The Great Convergence that describes it. I served over 10 years as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, and I've gone to the trenches of the UN, and I can see how they weaken the UN deliberately, consistently. And if you want some examples, number one, you spoke about UN Security Council expansion. frankly, a UN Security Council in the year 2020, as Martin Wolf said, with the UK inside and India outside is absolutely absurd. And frankly, if the United Kingdom wants to make up for its years of colonial rule of India, it should give the Security Council seat to India today. And that would be the most sensible change in the global order that could happen. But do you think the Europeans will ever give up their seats? No. And I can tell you that the main opposition to Security Council reform, regardless of whatever you read, comes from the United States. And I was in the State Department meeting a very senior State Department official who told me to my face, he said, Kishore, 15 members is tough enough for the United States. We don't want more, categorically. And that's where the opposition is coming. We must understand where it's coming from. And then the Europeans, unfortunately, have been tacitly or implicitly helping to weaken multilateral organizations by depriving it of the funding that it needs. And if you want a classic example, at a time when the world should be having a very strong World Health Organization, the Europeans have steadily pushed down the mandatory funding of the WHO from which was about 70% in the 70s down to 18% today. How the hell do you make an organization strong over the long term if you don't guarantee it mandatory funding over the long term? Obviously, it's going to remain weak. And clearly, the Europeans have as much responsibility today for the weakening of multilateral institutions that I can, but just as in passing, I serve on the Commission of Eminent Persons for the review of the International Atomic Energy Agency under former President Ernesto Zedillo. And again, when we dissected the IAEA, we could see how the Europeans were trying to weaken it instead of trying to strengthen an organization dedicated to preventing nuclear proliferation. Now that's the bad news. So what's the good news? What's the synthesis? The great hope we have, and the reason why I'm much more optimistic than most people are about the future of multilateralism, is that it is now in the interests of the West, once again, to strengthen multilateralism. Why? To use change metaphors, we live in a very small global village. The West only makes up 12% of the world's population. If you are the most affluent 12% in a global village, you have a greater vested interest in stronger village councils, in stronger multilateral institutions than anybody else does. It's just that the West hasn't realized it yet. But it's got to wake up to realize it. And the one man who actually warned the West, and especially the United States, it's time to change course, is the former President Bill Clinton in a speech in Yale in 2003. He said, if America is going to remain number one forever, fine, we can keep on doing whatever we are doing. No one's going to stop us. But Bill Clinton added a but. He said, but if you can conceive of a world where we are no longer number one, where we are number two, then surely it is in America's national interest to strengthen multilateral rules, multilateral norms, multilateral institutions, multilateral processes. And of course, Bill Clinton is absolutely right. Sadly, his fellow Americans didn't listen to him, but at some point it's not going to happen under Donald Trump. Certainly the Trump administration would like to destroy any multilateral institution it can find, he even walks away from mandatory UN Security Council resolutions like the resolution on Iran. So he thinks international law is an inconvenience, but let's hope the number one, that Joe Biden's elected. Let's hope we go back to a saner America, and then hopefully we can go back to a world which focuses on rebuilding multilateral institutions. So contrary to most people, I'm actually optimistic that multilateralism will become stronger in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore, for an excellent opening remarks here, summarizing the situation through the three poles of synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis was brilliant. And may I now request Lydia, another 7 to 8 minutes, Lydia?
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for this invitation to speak. And I'm really happy to see this panel of distinguished speakers. We never met in person, but I read your works, and it's really great to participate in this discussion together with you. And thanks to Mr. Mehta for bringing everyone on board for this discussion. So as I'm representing Russia, although I'm not a Russian official, I would like to cover Russia's priorities in multilateralism, because Russia is the country that believes very strongly in this concept, and with all its efforts, both on the official level and unofficial level, tries to promote various multilateral formats. And I would like just to draw your attention to the priorities Russia has in terms of multilateralism. As was rightly mentioned, in the current situation, multilateralism has a new chance. And although the forces of regional gravity, as it may seem, are stronger than ever, so many countries today are calling for self-reliance. They all close their borders, they're all trying to fight on their own. But at the same time, the current situation shows us that there is no alternative, and the problems of massive global scale cannot be resolved independently. They need common multilateral approach. And we see so many various forces, the US-China rivalry, the Indian-Chinese problems also so acute. And although these are bilateral issues, multilateralism even here has a chance to play its positive role. For instance, let's take G20. This is the format that, first of all, India is about to become the chair of G20 soon. And this is the format that Russia believes in very strongly, as opposed to G7, for instance. As you know, Russia is no longer a member of this exclusive, very small club of countries, but at the same time, this small club does not represent the current world at all. And it is rather the format like G20 that is much more representative of the current trends. Then let's move to the very important organization, as Mr. Mahbubani has mentioned, the United Nations. Russia was one of the founding members, and it believes very strongly that UN Security Council needs to be enlarged with countries like India and Brazil. It is no longer representative of the current world at all. And again, India soon will have a seat as a non-permanent member in the UN Security Council. And again, it is an opportunity, to reflect the realities of today's world much better than it happens in this particular moment. Another priority for Russia is Eurasia. And in this vast space, as Eurasia is, the format of Russia, India, China plays an extremely important role. It is the most important stabilizing triangle that has a chance to stabilize this vast space, which Russia considers its strategic priority. And it is equally important for China and India. That's why, although Russia's official position is not to interfere in Indian-Chinese relations, it is very obvious that Russia's priority is to make sure that RIG format functions well and the countries resolve their disputes in a very peaceful and neighborly and friendly manner. And in this relation, I would like to mention that we also had a long history of relations with China. We have a very extensive border with China, and fortunately, at the negotiations table, we managed to resolve all our, disputes and points of, concern. And we're now friendly and strategic partners, neighbors. And I also hope that in Indian-Chinese relations, there will be a breakthrough, because if I may say, in my experts, so to say, capacity, British drawn borders have never borne any peace or any long-term stability. Whatever the British in their imperial times have drawn borders, it has always been prone with conflict and with problems. And when today India and China are trying to resolve their issues, there is so much foreign interference, and I'm really concerned, again, if I may share my concern with you here, that expert community, both in China and in India, is very conflict focused. It is not in long-term interests of the two countries to destabilize the situation further. And I would really call on all experts and everyone who has a chance to speak publicly to really call on peaceful resolution of these issues, because this relationship lies really in the heart of Eurasia, and it is key to the stability and prosperity of this vast region. So this is my concern, and I would really like everybody to participate in peaceful resolution of the situation. As we continue on, this vast space of Eurasia, also Russia perspective is that Arctic and the Far East is extremely important for the prosperity and economic development of this region. And in Russian-Indian relations, the Far East will play a very important role. There's going to be an increased connectivity, and the two countries are working on bringing this Far Eastern region and India closer together in terms of economic links. And we all remember Prime Minister Narendra Modi saying "Act Far East" when he visited Vladivostok Economic Forum in 2019. So I'm also optimistic about all formats that bring Eurasia together, being RIC, Russia, India, China, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which also has the potential to play, a stabilizing role. Again, it is in Russia's, priorities to make these organizations and this format function well. Another priority on Russia's plate is BRICS format. And there are many critics of this format. And, from outsiders' view, of course, it may seem that countries pursue their own interests within this format, but let me also draw your attention to the fact that there have been some successes in the functioning of BRICS format. For instance, the New Development Bank is a very well-funded organization, and there have been about 50 projects that have been financed by the New Development Bank, organized by BRICS. And there is going to be, a new focus on cross-border multilateral projects in financing by this bank. And of course, this bank is going to function in the benefits of all member states, not just individual projects of individual countries. Also, the new revised version of BRICS Economic Partnership Strategy 2020 is a very up-to-date economic program, and it resonates very strongly with the priorities that are now faced by all countries in the face of pandemic. I remember about the time limit. I'm going to conclude very shortly. Thanks for the reminder. And these priorities in the economic strategy resonate very strongly with the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which have been, slightly distant in everyone's list of priorities, but the pandemic has really made them very acute. And here we're talking about healthcare, education, innovation, digitalization, and everything around fourth industrial revolution. And as Mr. Mahbubani has mentioned, the so-called developed world is now much more face-to-face with the problems of the so-called developing world, and there is no such limit between the and distance between the developed world and so-called developing world. And that's why, again, India has a great opportunity in bringing its own country priorities on the global scale, because India's priorities are now the same as global priorities and global tasks faced by all countries, regardless of whether it is the UK, Russia, US. We have seen, every country struggle with the same, effort and the same, difficulty in the current situation. That's why, the priorities now are really the same for everyone. And here, my last point is, I read very carefully the description of today's discussion, and let me make a small note. You mentioned also, Mr. Mehta, in your opening speech, that today everyone is faced with the lack of rules. This is absolutely correct. But in Russia's view, when we talk about rules, and please don't misunderstand me, this is not just about, wording, but rules is something that is developed by a limited club of countries, as we see it, for a specific situation. We would like to talk about rather international law developed and put into force by reputed global organizations like United Nations. That's why rules is something ad hoc, to the situation, to the interests of some certain players, but let's promote the value of international law to, to really resolve the issues of today's world, be it the healthcare pandemic, or for instance, digitalization. It's a very acute topic which everyone today faces, and it is going to play a more and more important role going forward. And be it individual countries where we as citizens have to, foresee development of laws around this new reality, digital reality. And it is the same in international relations. We do not need just temporary rules, but we need strong international law that is guarding and that is, managing the new digital world. For instance, this is just an example, and it again proves the importance of multilateralism. The world is self-reliant in its own way, but it is more interdependent than ever. Thank you, and
thank you very much.
Too much time.
Thank you very much, Lydia. And I think the last point you made was very important. That digitalization, particularly, is opening up multilateralism in a big way. Though, I mean, the webinar was not a discussion on bilateral relations, but since you raised it, I concede your point that it should be peace. We all are striving for peace. With that, may I now come to Asoke Mukerji? Asoke, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pradeep, for inviting me, and very good morning to all my co-panelists, some of whom I've known for several years now. I think that the remarks that you made, Pradeep, and that Ambassador Mahbubani has made actually stimulate a lot of thought. And I would like to put 5 perspectives or 5 points into this discussion that we are having. The first is, of course, that multilateralism is not only a preferred structure for regulating and interacting between states based on the principle of international cooperation, but multilateralism is also probably for a country like India something that is non-negotiable, because the transformation of India depends on a functional multilateral system. You, Pradeep, are an expert on trade, and you know that almost 40% of our GDP is contributed by international trade. So how do we in India oppose multilateralism? It's self-evident. The second point that I would like to make is that although all of us remember what happened 75 years ago when the United Nations was created and the Charter was signed, I think that one fact that has happened in these 75 years, which is relevant and relevant for the future of multilateralism, is that a large number of people who were not in control of their own destinies in 1945, being under colonial rule at that time, have now become independent and are equal members of this multilateral system. You just have to look at the UN General Assembly, 193 countries, each country with 1 vote. That is democratization of international relations. But the hard realities, which all of us are aware of, show that we still have not completed this process of democratizing international relations. And I think that the reforms that we speak of, which are necessary for multilateralism, actually address this issue. And this is the issue of equity. A country like India, which became independent of colonial rule, and then within 3 years in 1950 adopted a constitution which guarantees one citizen, one vote, and equal participation in decision making, cannot be expected in a multilateral setting to agree to decision making not on the same principle of one country, one vote. And I think that this is something that is important as I see it to strengthen multilateralism. The third point is something that you mentioned, Pradeep, about Pascal Lamy having said in your previous webinar. And it is something that I also, having lived through these recent negotiations in the United Nations, also believe in. And that is that the time has come, I believe, for multilateralism to be revitalized through the participation of a multi-stakeholder model. I think that the time is now on us. Given the challenges that we face, the responses that we are required to adopt in response to these challenges, that we need to count on other stakeholders apart from governments. And this is something that requires a lot of discussion and, of course, negotiation, because the entrenched positions of sovereign states is entrenched. And how do we bring in this whole idea of multi-stakeholderism in multilateralism? I can give two examples. The Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development is a good example of multi-stakeholder participation in negotiations and an outcome which was being endorsed by the multi-stakeholder community and is being implemented by the multi-stakeholder community. So the United Nations has shown that it can actually work if we all put our shoulders to it. And the second, of course, is what Lydia mentioned a little while ago, and on which Latha Reddy is a great expert, and that is the Tunis agenda, the digital agenda, which is again a multi-stakeholder approach to multilateralism. And I think that these two examples show that it is possible for us to conceptualize and revitalize multilateralism as we move ahead into this 21st century. The fourth point, and this is something that I think is important, is how do you enforce multilateral systems and the rule of law, what Lydia talked about as international law. And I think that enforcement has always been a big challenge, right from the days we created the League of Nations till today. How do you enforce the rule of law in an equitable and transparent manner? Now, we have examples. You have talked about the South China Sea, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. Some members, parties to the treaty have fulfilled their obligations, some have not. So how do you enforce? And this is a question that I'd like to put before the distinguished panel. I mean, how do you enforce the rule of law? And the final point that I'd like to make is that while we talk about the 12% rich member states of the multilateral system having an interest in the global village, I think that the time has probably come 75 years after the UN Charter was signed in 1945 to revisit this whole idea of what are the values that unite humanity today. Because the discussion has to go into the principles and values which anchor multilateralism. And I think that unless we are able to have this discussion, we are not going to have a common understanding of what multilateralism means for each one of the 193 countries that today make up the United Nations family. So what are these values? And I think this is something that in India and in Asia, we have a very strong, vibrant tradition called the unity of mankind. So this is the perspective that can come from a country like India into this discussion, the unity of mankind, in which we have diversity, but we also have a unity, a core unity, which propels us forward. And therefore, I'd like to conclude by making the point that, and I agree with Ambassador Mahbubani 100%, that we cannot and should not expect a recreation and a redrawing of multilateralism. Today, that is not possible. We need to reform and revitalize multilateralism from within. And it has to come from within on the basis of the principles which I mentioned, of which the foremost, as I see it as a practitioner, is the principle of equity, equal participation in decision making. We are not living in 1945 anymore. The four policemen concept is out of the window. We need to be equal participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashok, and that was again an excellent remark which you made in with those 5 points, and particularly what we'll come to Latha later on the issue about digitalization. Of course, I know of her skills and her experience. But just to mention, as Kishore, what you did mention was about the fact is that the US is one of the most non-cooperative international citizens, and we know that. I mean, it's happened. They walked out of the WHO also. They're killing the WTO, as it were, and would be happy to walk out, have threatened to walk out many days. They're not part of International Criminal Court. They're not part of so many other things. What was surprising was, including a soft body like International Parliamentary Union, they're not a member of that. The US Parliament is not, the Congress or the Senate are not a member of the International Parliamentary Union. This is what I came, came to my surprise. I was addressing an IPU meeting in Geneva on W2 issues. When this fact came up, I said, well, I don't see any Americans in the room. So they are not a part of this IPU. They don't believe in IPU. So you can well imagine, I mean, this cuts across. When we talk in terms of civil society or we talk in terms of multi-stakeholders, here is an example of a stakeholder multilateral body where you won't call IPU a government body in that sense. It's a stakeholders body, it's a parliamentary body, and I was quite surprised that one of the most alive democracies are not represented in the International Parliamentary Union. But be that as it may I now invite Henry. Henry, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Pradeep, and really all the distinguished panelists and our viewers too. So it's really a great honor for me to attend this great webinar. I think it's really timely and relevant to the current situation. I miss the days, if I can go to India to attend a conference offline. I was for the last few years I went to India every year. I attended like a GrowthNet, I attended the CI annual forum, and also Hindu this time. And last time when I attended Hindu this time annual conference, I was in dialogue with Dr. Jaishankar, then before he went down to the foreign minister of India. So it was great memories of all the discussion we had in India. I think the topic today is really highly relevant. I 100% agree with many of the issues that Kishore raised as well, and also I think Ambassador Mukerji also mentioned quite well. What are we facing, and what are we going to do? I mean, this year is exactly 75 years of UN anniversary, and we see the after Bretton Woods moment, all those years, the world is really functioned relatively peacefully. We were successfully preventing the Third World War, I mean, after UN system and multilateral system being established. But now, it's come to a moment now. I mean, it's at the crossroad now, and we are facing not really a human being third war, but we are facing a world war with a virus. I mean, that's also a very heavy and very casualty-wise is also a heavy loss. So what are we going to do? We are facing a common threat now: the climate change, the all those new virus and all those new uncertainties. So the system really needs to be upgraded. I totally agree that we should not reinvent the wheel, but we should really maintain, upgrade, and improve and reform. So I think that countries like China, India, Russia, I mean also European countries, or even including the United States, should really work together. I mean, towards the ASEAN is also playing a huge role now these days. I think that's really something that we could really all work on. Unfortunately, we see ideological conflict. We see regional conflict is getting also heavy now. We have to really be very careful of that, and we should really I think also have a cool heads, and we should really think of the future of the mankind. And so for the next 75 years, let's maybe put in a longer horizon. What can we do? I mean, so I have this some preliminary thought that maybe I could share here is that I think an organization like WHO, WTO, and multilateral system should really be maintained and be improved. They are not perfect. There are a lot of things can be changed, but we should not abandon that or boycott that or really quit that. So that's really not the right attitude. I mean, it's the time where we need unity the most, and then we don't want to divide it. And then those multilateral organizations is facing all the crises. So, for example, WHO, we need a really big support to that. China pledged $2 billion to support the developing country fighting COVID-19. And then, China is also a strong supporter of WHO. And on the WTO, you mentioned Pascal. He was also on the webinar we had. Also, he and I, we were sitting on the Paris Peace Forum Steering Committee. I agree with you. We need to do more. We have actually last time we invited Wendy Cutler, we invited Alan Wolf on my webinar, and we talked about WTO maybe need more strong leadership now. And so China probably and India and other countries should play more forthcoming to lead the WTO, and particularly also European countries, so that that the leadership crisis can be solved. We hope that US is coming back someday, but let's really currently we should really put more focus. Another proposal is the Secretary of WTO should play more role rather than passively follow the member countries. They should be more innovative in terms of WTO reform. So that's, I think, something we need to really work on. I was in Geneva just last year on the WTO annual forum. I proposed that, for example, some low-hanging fruit we should really get a hold on it, like anti-pollution emission to the ocean, which is already agreed by G20 in Osaka that by 2050 we should have zero emission to the ocean. So I gave a talk to the 9 ambassadors of WTO about the initiative that WTO should act first to really get all the rules and regulations established in terms of anti-ocean dumping and emissions. So that was actually well received by all the ambassadors. So something small we can start. Another thing I think I agree with all of you mentioned that the digital economy. Digital economy is really on the horizon and a huge development. And China just.
I think we've lost Henry. Pradeep?
Yeah, I know. I see that there's a problem with his link.
The link is probably collapsed, yeah.
And you can see it, visual. Hey, what I suggest we should move on to Latha, and when Henry comes back, then we'll ask him to complete after Latha has finished. Latha, over to you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I was, firstly, let me say that every single presentation I've heard has been fascinating and has really reinforced the importance of multilateralism to solve many of our crises today. Now, firstly, let me say that multilateralism in the technical definition for me doesn't necessarily mean. I agree with you, Ashok, that it's important to have equality and equity and that every country should be heard. But technically speaking, multilateralism means many countries working together. That is the technical definition of the term. So the problem with that definition is it allows these alliances of like-minded countries to come together, which have a common agenda and excludes other voices. Therefore, I'm personally in favor of all countries being heard and what is the more common understanding of multilateralism. Now, there are lots of examples of areas where multilateralism has worked and created mechanisms that have prevented disasters and fostered cooperation, at least partially, if not perfectly. Just briefly, we've talked about the IAEA, we've of course talked about the UN itself. You can talk about ICAO, the aviation, the civil aviation group. You can talk about UNCLOS. You can talk about outer space, USA. You can talk about WHO, you can talk about WTO, you can talk about ITU, you can talk about chemical weapons. Now, the point is, you can argue that they have not prevented certain things from happening, but my point is, how much more would have happened if you had not had these mechanisms in place? It would have been a completely lawless situation, in a sense. But I personally see 4 areas where we desperately need need multilateralism. The first is the geopolitical and economic area. The second is technology, which I'll talk about a little more. The third is environment. And the fourth is societal. And I also think that I'd like to mention some specific areas. We need to work on the COVID pandemic and other possible pandemics which could come up, so health. We need to work on cyberspace and new technologies. We need to work on SDGs. We need to work to combat terrorism. And we need to work on climate change. These are global challenges that require global approaches. Now, coming to cyberspace itself, or the cyber technologies and the allied technologies, I see the main challenges in cybersecurity terms as relating to cybercrime, this use of cyberspace for terrorism, and the protection of critical information infrastructures. I also see a problem where we do not have a universal system of internet governance, although this is something that does not respect borders. Exactly like COVID, it will spread worldwide. Exactly like the breakdown of financial systems, it will spread worldwide. And therefore, I'm completely in agreement with those who have argued for the multi-stakeholder model, because I think that to go only on in internet governance, there's the question of jurisprudence, jurisdiction, and the applicability of international law. These are very important issues in technology. Again, unless you have some agreement on what are the basics that will govern these areas, how will you ever have a good system of internet governance? Privacy and data, burning questions today, and the question of how human rights applies to rights online as well as offline. Freedom of information and speech, which is a burning issue. Sovereignty of states, which is a burning issue. Surveillance issues, which is again something which states are very divided in their approach towards. Hate speech, fake news, manipulation and misuse of social media, all these have had a tremendous effect on today's world. I myself follow social media and I'm active on social media, but I have to say I'm horrified by the amount of misinformation that's put out there and the amount of active, really the question of ethics and values, which is not something which comes up very often in a discussion on technology, but it's a particular passion of mine. When we are using these remarkable new technologies of artificial intelligence, robotics, manipulation of human intelligence in many ways, where does the question of ethics and values come in? And we need to have discussions on these issues as well. There are many organizations that are trying to do this. You know, in the UN itself, as many of you know, there's an open-ended working group. There's on cyber issues. There's the UN governmental group of experts. There's the high-level panel set up by the Secretary General. There's the roadmap, which has then been announced by the Secretary General. You have organizations like UNIDIR, UNODA, disarmament groups, and of course, the forthcoming, expected big initiatives of the UN at 75, which has somewhat been, overtaken by events and the COVID pandemic. But I would assume we are going to hear much more about these initiatives. any group today, any international multilateral or plurilateral or the polylateralism, as they called it, for the multi-stakeholder model, any group talks about technologies, talks about cyber issues. And this goes from the G20 to every other group, BRICS, all the groups that have been mentioned. And definitely the Tunis WISIS agenda was a good starting point for the world. And at that point, there seemed to be much more global consensus. We're living in a very difficult world today where major powers are pitted against each other and almost as a matter of course will not agree to cooperate on any matters, least of all technologies. But there are groups which I believe truly multi-stakeholder. You have the IGF, you have the Paris Peace Forum, you have the Global Commissions, two of which I've been involved in, one of which I've co-chaired, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace and the Global Commission on Internet Governance, the Tech Accord and other groups put out by industry. You've got the Cyber Peace Institute and many, many think tanks, many groupings that are very seriously considering this all over the world. So I believe there's a plethora of goodwill and there's a plethora of good intentions to try to come to some agreements on this. And I, again, am an optimist. I believe that we will eventually come up with a loosely knit systems which will govern these new technologies. And that is part of what multilateralism is going to be all about in the future, because we live in such an interconnected world that unless we have a common understanding of how to do this, it is not going to work. So I'll stop here and I'll be happy to discuss some of these issues further if there are more questions.
Thank you very much, Latha. That was another excellent denouement, I would say. And we've had some very rich discussion, but I would like to come back to Henry because you were cut short by technical problems. But before that, let me request those in the audience if they could key in their questions. I'll be very grateful. One question which has come, Henry, which you can respond to begin with, is how can we use the opportunity provided by COVID-19 to restructure multilateralism and place Agenda 2030 back at the highest priority of the world? This is by Shilo Chatterjee. Over to you, Henry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pradeep. And sorry, I was off the line. No, I think that it's really a great initiative that I think that countries like India and China and all other European also countries like China just had a summit with European leaders, and then they agreed to collaborate. I think the vaccine is also developed China, Russian, and U.S. probably. So I think this, you're fighting this World War scale battle against the virus. It really should unite the humankind, and then we are really missing that. So I think what we could do is that I know that Joe Biden said he's going to come back to WHO. We hope that WHO is still a useful platform that we can reform it, enhance it, and also consolidate that. So I think we really need global united efforts to combat COVID-19, and then this is probably the best occasion that we can still in the middle of it and can grasp the opportunity that this window is very short now. I think we need to do that. And countries like India and other China and other countries should really work together on those things. I just want to finish the part left. I think that we'll talk about digital data. China will just propose 8 new rules about data flow that stipulates that government should not force companies to ship back their data. So I think China is moving ahead now on some of those ideas. So those are something interesting. China is also interested in the joint CPTPP, which is have a very high standard of data management and also SOE reform and environmental and labor rights and everything. So that could serve as a good improvement, just like China, join other international treaties so that we can enhance, improve as well along those international standards. Premier Li actually announced that at the Great Hall of People when he answered a news reporter that is China interested to join TPP. Premier Li said China is open to that. And I think also on RCEP, maybe we could strengthen that with ASEAN, 10+5 or 10+6. We really hope that India can still be part of that, because it's going to be really prosperity for our whole region. I mean, China, India being two largest economy, we have so many in complementary, so many things to learn each other, and then with such a long history of civilization. So something we hope can do. And also, someone just mentioned about BRICS. I think BRICS is also a great platform. We need to strengthen that. And also, this AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China has initiated that, but I think India is a big player, and we have a vice president from India, and India is the largest recipient of AIIB loans. So things like that we should really continue. And India also has the Spicy Road, and China's BRI. Maybe somewhere we could find a common denominator to work on. So I think economy should tie us together with the globalization of the economy, and rather than this regional historical baggage we may have. So I think it's important that we work together. And finally, on the globalization, you all mentioned about Paris Peaceful. I think our civil society, think tanks. So I think the CARTS International is doing a great job. I mean, CCG and the think tanks and also institutions, we should work together as well to propose new globalization initiative. I know that Ambassador Kishore has been a champion in that. So it's really great. We can work on those new initiatives. So globalization, vertical globalization, that we need, not just between governments, but also players like us that can play also important role. And finally, I think that China probably need a new narrative. China seems doing okay on the KPI in terms of the country performance, in terms of economy and everything. But then somehow, in the world is also it seems getting a lot of negative comments. So probably China need a new theory, new narrative to really explain well, and then maybe use the language, international language that everybody understands, so that we can really reduce the misunderstanding, and then we can really help the world together. China, after all, is contributing over 30% of global GDP. It's the largest trading nation with 130 countries, and it's second largest donor to the United Nations. And so I think that we can do better together with all the countries, particularly I think our friends in India and Russian and European and ASEAN. I mean, those there are so many things can work together. So I stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henry, and that is great. I have two questions to the panel. The first is, what is the role of regional cooperation to promote multilateral cooperation? And that's very important. It's like building blocks, as it were. Unlike the Bhagwati's definition of spaghetti bowl, in terms of international cooperation, regionalism going on up to a global is. The second and an important question is, which has not been addressed properly, is multilateralism is somehow understood to be globalization for a large number of common people in the world. Now, there are many losers which have come about ever since the WTO came into being, and that's one of the reasons why we find populism rising everywhere against international trade, as it were. And so somehow multilateralism then gets affected in this process. So what are the three possible ways forward in order to deal with this kind of issue? Can I start with you, Kishore? And I'll come back to you, Henry, on this.
Thank you. Two very good questions. Number one, I think that regional cooperation is extremely important. You're right, the key word is building blocks. And you need basically countries to discover that as they give up some of their sovereignty, they are actually better off, not worse off. And there's one key word that so few of us have used today, which is the concept of sovereignty, which comes back from the Treaty of Westphalia 372 years ago, I believe. So that concept, frankly, needs to be eroded, because if you live in one world, you clearly have to. Excuse me. There's this one. You have to deal with you have to give up your sovereignty as part of the struggle to achieve international cooperation. And on the question of losers, let me quickly, 2 lines. You will have short-term losers, always. Because as you know, Joseph Schumpeter told us, right? Capitalism is also about creative destruction. But it's not the short term you must calculate, it's the long term. And in the long term, the World Trade Organization has done more to eradicate global poverty than any organization ever could in human history, okay? So let's be very, very clear. The multilateralism doesn't create losers, it creates winners in the long run. Thank you. My apologies for the call.
Ashok. Ashok, over to you.
Thank you. The 2 questions that you have posed are important, Kishore. And I think Kishore has given a good way to look at both these issues. I would like to start by just pointing to one fact in multilateral systems and in decisions, is that I agree that we have large majorities and small like-minded groups and all kinds of diversity of opinion. But I think it's important that when we decide something in a multilateral setting, that we decide in an equitable manner. And the only way in which a country like India does it is through a democratic voting exercise, a majority vote. And this is built into all multilateral, in the World Health Organization, for example, the governing council takes a decision by a 2/3 majority if there is no unanimity, if there's no consensus. So in the UN Charter, if this is an important issue, there's a 2/3 majority vote requirement. So this principle of democracy is very important. And I think it's important to keep it in mind when we talk about the interests of smaller groups and like-minded groups and so on and so forth. Because that goes to the question that you have posed from the participants today. And that is regarding how to sustain the multilateral effort. And I think sustaining a multilateral effort will only be possible if it is felt to be of common interest to the vast majority of members of the multilateral system. Otherwise, the Security Council is a good example. It cannot sustain any of its decisions because, frankly, the rest of the world is now fed up of the way in which all these decisions are not taken or taken in a very compromised manner. So that is one. And the second, and I again agree with Ambassador Mahbubani, that, and having worked in the World Trade Organization, I agree even more, that this is one organization where we have seen in our own lifetimes the tremendous change that has taken place. I mean, you have to come to India. You remember India in 1994 and you go to India and you come to India today and you can see the changes that have taken place. The smartphone that we are all so used to, the smartphone would have never reached the Indian market if we hadn't agreed to let it come into to India without any restrictions in the telecom negotiations of 1997. I signed that negotiation. I know what I'm talking about. So I think that this is the point that we have to make, that the losers are actually, they have to, it has to be seen in a longer term perspective. And I completely agree with Ambassador Mahbubani on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Lydia?
All right. There was a question about law enforcement. How do you enforce international law? It's always been a challenge. And Currently, what do we have? We have unilateral sanctions that hit various countries upon the discretion of a limited club of nations. Of course, this is again Russia's concern, but the only way to enforce international law is by mechanisms that already exist. This is the United Nations Security Council, which of course, as I mentioned, we believe needs to be enlarged to make it more, to make it more reflecting of today's world. And then there is a mechanism of UN-approved sanctions, which is probably the most efficient mechanism for international law enforcement. It needs to be, not country-based, but it needs to be a UN security-based mechanism. And as to regional clubs, in my brief speech, I probably have drawn a lot of attention to exactly this point, the regional clubs.
Eurasia.
I agree with all other speakers that these are the small building blocks of larger multilateral mechanisms. And unless the countries know how to work together, on the regional issues, they can bring up their regional issues to a higher, multilateral international level. And this is an efficient mechanism. And many, as Ms. Reddy has, highlighted, many mechanisms have worked very efficiently in this way. So yes, I agree with everyone that regional multilateralism is a building block of larger international multilateralism that needs to be promoted and encouraged in all possible ways.
Thanks, Lydia. Over to you, Latha.
Okay. I wanted to actually address the question of regional cooperation as well, following on from what Lydia said.
That is a question asked to you also.
Yeah.
All the panelists.
I would, while I'm sure Kishore knows much more about this than I do, I want to specifically address the question of ASEAN, which I see as one of the most successful regional cooperation bodies. In keeping with the brief given to me, I want to talk about how well ASEAN has done on technology issues, right? Because I was in Singapore, I think it was 2 years ago, when the ASEAN ministers met and they decided to completely endorse the UNGGE norms. So not only did ASEAN come up with its own game plan between the 10 ASEAN members to deal with cyber issues, they also endorsed a global plan. So this is the question, again, of a building block where regional cooperation in an area then moves into a global acceptance. Similarly, one of the norms that we came up with in the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace was the norm of protecting the public core of the internet, which is essentially the underpinnings, the technical underpinnings that let the internet function, right? So the EU adopted this norm, in the EU in entirety, all the 28 countries, or whatever number it's now reached with Britain moving out. And they adopted this norm and they passed it into public law for the EU itself. So hopefully at some point, this will also be accepted globally, multilaterally. So I want to give you 2 specific examples of how regional cooperation can lead to a multilateral or a global acceptance of certain principles. So that's why I think regional cooperation is so important. And before I stop my comment on this, I just want to say, for me, ASEAN is the mechanism that has worked best. I was ambassador to Thailand. I dealt with, and I'm filled with admiration for how this organization has progressed. Yes, it's had problems. Yes, it's had conflicts within the group. But I would still say it's the most successful group so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Latha. Henry, over to you.
Okay. Well, I want to actually address the question of regional cooperation in an area. Then moves into a global acceptance of certain principles. So that's why I think regional cooperation is so important. And before I stop my comment on this, I just want to say, for me, ASEAN is the mechanism that has worked best. I was ambassador to Thailand. I dealt with, and I'm filled with admiration for how this organization has progressed. Yes, it's had problems. Yes, it's had conflicts within the group. But I would still say it's the most successful group so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Latha. Henry, over to you. Dr. Wang Hui.
Okay. Hi. Yeah,
Yeah.
I have to.
Sorry, no,
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, thank you, Pradeep. No, I think you have raised excellent questions. I mean, in terms of the question about regional impact, regional cooperation, I think I agree with all the panelists that if the global consensus has not been reached, we should at least reach the regional consensus. So I think that the regions organization like ASEAN, which is a great example, China, 10 plus 3, 10 plus 6, RCEP, CPTPP, I remember Kishore's the book on ASEAN 50 years anniversary, Chinese edition released at Peking University. I was there.
Yeah.
To see that is really great. And so it's an excellent example of that. And we should really continue on that. I really hope that there could be an Asian community, somehow if we can reach consensus. Also, Shanghai Cooperation, I mean, BRICS and all those, we should maybe, get more economic element to that. If something can be reached, for example, data agreements, if it can be reached between the BRICS countries or Shanghai Cooperation, that's practice. That put more economic regulation into that. So that would be really great. Second question regarding the losers or that, I think that the problem we're having for the last several decades is global governance is falling behind global practice. The 1% of the Wall Street is equal to almost 50% of the mass population in the US. And then China take all the blame probably because, for common stories like Apple makes Apple phone. China make 50 bucks of that, but then, they can sell $1,000 in the national market. But then on the export account, China probably earned about 500-600 in terms of Trump's calculation. So that's really not fair. But then President Trump announced cut taxes. Apple announced they're going to repatriate $350 billion back to the United States. Apple makes $50 billion a year in China. So, but the money they made by the multinationals, are they really trickle down to the Rust Belt, to the West, to the populism, where all the poor losers? That's only another problem for the U.S., but also for European, for Japan, for all the multinationals. So I think that that's probably the issue that we need to solve. That how we can really encourage the company to operate worldwide, but also our governance system should really comes up. So the European country proposed this digital tax. I think it's probably one of the right thing to do in the future. But that's the thing. I shouldn't have in China taking all the blame, whereas I think all the multinational laugh all the way to the banks. And but then they are not really benefiting the general mass population where they elected a BRICS, elected President Trump, and continue to elect President Trump if this governance falling behind global practice issues not solved. So that's really my personal interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. But before you go away, fact is that in all likelihood, Trump is going to be re-elected. All likelihood, it's anybody's guess how things move. I don't know. There's an important question for you and others also. How can bilateral issues be resolved by multilateral cooperation?
Well, I think that the bilateral issue is also important. I think first of all, people need to see face to face. This COVID-19 has really put the things difficult because we don't really see each other anymore. There's no side talks, there's no dinner, there's no lunch. It's all everything. The people stop meeting each other. That's really very dangerous. That's number one. Number two, I think that we really need to talk. The business. I mean, the economic. I think the economic common sense will probably prevail in the end. I think the business voice will come out. So I think, we really have to look at the reality that after all, we've been all prosperous. We've been, 1 billion people has been lifted out of poverty thanks to the global system, thanks to the dialogue, bilateral relation. We need to really, I think it's to create a climate of a dialogue, of understanding, and also not stereotyping, interpret each other. So that's probably we need to do most as well. Finally, I think that that China being one of the fast developing countries now, there's some structural problem. There's also reform taking place in China. China is continue to deepen reform and opening up, and I think that is really also using the market to welcome all the companies' investment around the world. So we hope to keep good relations with everyone, and we'll continue to contribute to the well-being of the mankind. I think that's probably the message China should do.
Can I ask Peter Draper? Peter, are you there? Peter Draper? Yeah.
I am here, Pradeep.
Great. Peter, nice to see you here. Can I ask you a question in the context of WTO? Peter is a trade expert, South African working in Australia now. Ashok Mukerji spoke about the fact is that voting is possible in WHO or in many other countries, except that it doesn't happen in the WTO. And that's one of the reasons why, there's every country has a veto power, number one. Number two is we spoke about bilateral issues to be resolved by multilateral cooperation. The WTO has an excellent model of dispute settlement. It's basically a bilateral issue through a multilateral forum, but even that has now been held hostage. And therefore, this is something which is bothering the whole trading community. Over to you, 5 minutes.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the question is about whether a vote could be brought to settle the appellate body issue. Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay, so nothing prevents...
And the second is voting. Democracy in WTO.
Right, so that's an interesting question. So I've been debating this issue with Professor Henry Gao at Singapore Management University, because he's been arguing very forcefully that a vote should be brought, and basically that the US should be outvoted, because that is likely to happen. And that's really around the appointment of appellate body judges. And certainly WTO members could do that if they so chose. I regard that as the nuclear option, because I think that would be very likely to force the US to essentially leave the WTO. Not that they need more excuses, but it could well be the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were. Now, Henry argues that we should call the US's bluff, and maybe he's right. I have not made my mind up on that issue, I have to say, because clearly there's a strong case for those countries that want to proceed with the appointment of appellate body judges to exercise their majority and to do so. But if they were to effectively lead to kicking the founder of the system out, I'm not sure that's a good outcome. But that said, I really like the way Kishore framed the issues. And I completely agree with him on this, that ultimately, I strongly believe the US needs the WTO, not least to constrain China, even though it doesn't like the Chinese model. And that's very clear. So I think the US is caught on the horns of a dilemma. And this is what Henry is trying to mobilize, in a sense. I'm just not sure I would do it under a Trump administration. And that said, Pradeep, I'm not sure I agree with you that he will be elected. Unless
maybe.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise, Pradeep.
Hope to see you again very soon. Now, if there are no further questions, I would like to turn to the panelists for their last word. There's one question for you, Kishore, I forgot, which I must tell you. There is a selfish nature of countries that, they would only accept something which is, to their benefit, or at least not to their harm. In a multilateral system, that is always something which is a contentious issue. How would you resolve that? How can it be resolved?
Well, it's actually very, very easy, because it is in our selfish interest to support multilateralism. And I would just want to go back to the boat analogy, okay? Here we are, all 7.5 billion people now living on the same boat, right? And we have a cabin on that boat. So if the boat sinks, right, we all sink with it. And I think the key point to emphasize, and I'm glad several participants have emphasized this, SDGs and all that. I mean, the two biggest changes two biggest challenges we face: short-term COVID-19, long-term climate change. You cannot solve COVID-19 in one country. You cannot solve global warming in one country. You have to come back. So you have a selfish reason for global cooperation to save yourself. So actually, multilateralism is in our selfish interest. And also, just going back very quickly to the earlier point you made about trust, and can multilateralism help resolve bilateral issues? And the answer is yes. I first attended my first ASEAN meeting 50 years ago in 1971, and that's why I wrote this book, The ASEAN Miracle. When I went to my first ASEAN meeting in 1971, I walked into the room. There are 5 ASEAN countries. I could smell the distrust. You can smell it. The Indonesians distrusted Malaysia, Malaysians distrusted Singapore, and so on. Thailand distrusted Malaysia. There was so much bilateral distrust. When I became the foreign secretary of our foreign ministry, and I went back to ASEAN meetings in the mid-1990s, 25 years later, something like that, the distrust had evaporated. And why do you think Indonesia and Malaysia were able to resolve the issue of island dispute? Why do you think Singapore and Malaysia were able to resolve the dispute over Petra Branca, a small island? We went to the World Court. And how could we go to the World Court? We trusted each other, right? So actually, regional cooperation, like multilateral cooperation, builds up trust. And if we all have to live together on the same boat, for selfish reasons, it's in our interest to build up trust, and multilateralism produces trust.
Thank you very much. Would any of the panelists have anything else to add, or we would head towards conclusion? Latha, Reddy?
Yeah, I needed to unmute myself. I just want to go back to the question that you posed to Peter Draper, that how can bilateral issues be resolved by multilateral action? And I want to give you some concrete examples. For instance, you've already talked about the WTO and dispute resolution through the WTO mechanisms. I'd like to bring up some other agencies which have also helped to resolve bilateral issues through multilateral groups. One is the IAEA. I was myself accredited to the IAEA in Vienna, and I saw how at times inspections and intervention by the IAEA, while also allowing the peaceful uses of nuclear energy for positive issues such as medical research and so on, did build up trust between countries. And so that was a very specific example of how a multilateral agency can help resolve a bilateral issue. Look at the ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization. Again, disputes over what is the airspace, over what is one country. If you didn't have a multilateral agency looking at that, very small incidents could easily spill out of control and become a sort of confrontational situation. By referring it to the ICAO, many minor issues can be resolved. Thirdly, the UNCLOS. Again, while there are very conspicuous examples of where UNCLOS has been flouted, many minor issues have also been settled through UNCLOS. Similarly, the ITU. We wouldn't have the telecom connectivity that we have today if there wasn't an ITU. The WHO, what about the eradication of major diseases like smallpox and polio? Would that have been possible just as a national effort? No, because with increasing globalization, the diseases would have respread if you had not had an international policy on eradication of certain diseases. And that's why I think WHO is ultimately the only hope, even for the halting of pandemics such as what we're facing at the moment. And finally, let's look at the Outer Space Agency. clearing of space debris, whatever partial agreement we've been able to reach on the uses of outer space. Again, the situation would be much, much worse if you didn't have these multilateral mechanisms to address bilateral issues. So I think this is an important question, and that's why I've devoted some of my closing remarks to this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Lydia. Lydia, yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Just perhaps as a bridge to the next discussion, because there have been a very interesting question raised, and we have not had the time to, devote enough attention to it. It's the question of sovereignty and the evolving nature of sovereignty, how it is going to play. Because on one hand, yes, it is obvious that it evolves and the countries give more and more of their sovereignty away, or it is taken away by the situation. But at the same time, as Ms. Reddy has noted, in the digital era, there is going to be an issue of digital sovereignty. And my concern is that we are going to move to, separate bubbles of digital technological platforms, and countries are going to, gravitate to these technological platforms. And by this, they will be pulled apart. So there will be these bubbles of accepted technological platforms, as we can see with 5G, for instance, happening. And it's a whole, big issue, a separate discussion. And it could be a very interesting discussion in the changing world, how sovereignty is going to evolve and how it's going to change. And just to support other speakers, sustainability, climate change, and in a broader perspective, the sustainability is something that really unites everyone, all nations, and it is an opportunity to bring multilateralism to a new level, because it is something that is obvious to everybody without borders. Thank you again for this opportunity to...
Thank you very much. Let me personally thank each of the participants and for a very rich discussion. This is all being recorded. There are more people watching it on YouTube also at the same time. And invite my colleague, senior colleague, Vipul Chatterjee, to post a vote of thanks, including to highlight a few of the issues which he thinks are important.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta.
Hello.
It was so rich in its content in these deliberations. It's very, very difficult indeed to sum up all major points which have been made so far in a few minutes. But let me pick up one or 2 points which has been made during today's discussion. Rather, 2 points. One is that which Professor Mahbubani has said, that we need to understand the differences between short-term losers and long-term winners, particularly in the context of the evolving nature of globalization. While that is absolutely right, at the same time, we should not forget, in my opinion, about the losers. And that is one of the major reasons which I think behind this backlash against globalization which we are seeing today. Secondly, so therefore the need for understanding trade adjustment programs in particular, that is something which you need to revive. Secondly, again, what Professor Mahbubani has underlined towards the end of his presentation is that his example of trust among the ASEAN, distrust or trust among the ASEAN members. I mean, here there is absolutely no doubt what is needed is trust building among the nations, particularly for the delivery of global public good. But is it possible, I mean, taking the example of ASEAN, again, taking forward the views of Professor Mahbubani, is that why within a span of, let's say, a couple of decades, ASEAN members who were actually earlier they were distrusting themselves came to trust. I mean, what is that common factor which has helped them in having trust with each other? that is something we need to find out, those common factors for countries to trust each other. And I think that is possible. This trust building is possible if a better sense about the virtues of being a good international citizen prevails. Here I'm not going to take any names, but it is sufficient to underline that different countries have different values and they are intrinsic to their sovereignty. We also talked about sovereignty in various aspects in today's deliberation. Some of them may be thinking that there is too much of multilateralization of sovereignty, and that is evident from the history of the WTO. If we look at that history of the WTO for a quarter of a century. Therefore, to conclude, I would say that we need a much more balanced approach for understanding and exercising the values of agree to disagree. It is easier said than done, but that is something which is very much needed in taking forward the virtues of multilateralism. And this values of agree to disagree can come if we not just resurrect, but how to resurrect multilateralism. And that is, let me go back to what Pradeep has said in the beginning, and others have agreed to that, which is that we need to propound polylateralism, which effectively means that other bodies, multilateralism is not the prerogative of sovereign government, but it is equally important to make it a multi-stakeholder approach, including involving the civil society organizations, as Pradeep has rightly said in his opening remarks. So with that, let me thank all of you once again, and we're going to prepare a very brief report, and hopefully that by early next week, we're going to send that report not just to you, but also to all members of the United Nations. The UN General Assembly is going to be held in New York next week, or from next week. And hopefully when we are seeing this, one of the most devastating disruption that the world has seen since Second World War, a better sense is going to prevail sooner than later. So thank you very much once again.